Hey everybody, welcome back to the Engineered Angler. This week we're going to build another really classic lure. A lure build that was suggested by one of you guys, actually a subscriber named Hank. Now I'm pretty sure that Hank has been a long-time subscriber, and I'm sure that he's often in the rank of folks that are leaving messages and leaving comments and offering suggestions on lures. And this is what he suggested I should build. Allures Jensen and Sons lure. This is an old classic called a J-plug. Now these things started to be made way back, I think in the 50s, and they were originally made out of wood. Currently they're being made out of plastic like most every other lure. While a lot of people prefer wooden plugs, the use of plastic actually allows you to do a couple of nice things. One, it allows you to have a hollow body so that you can put rattles in it. And the other thing is that it's actually easier to chrome plate plastic than it is to chrome plate wood. But really the most unique part of the J-plug is the fact that they have a harness going through the body that allows the lure to actually slide up the line when you get a hookup. This is a concept sketch of a machine I'm working on. Now the lure shape is super simple. You'll see it's pretty obvious that it was originally made on a lathe, and that's how we're going to make ours. You get a symmetric torpedo shape. Of course, I didn't draw it perfectly symmetric, but you can tell what I'm talking about. And then the very front is cut off, and that front face is hollowed out. There's a port for the hardware drilled right about in the center of this face, and right about perpendicular to that chamfer cut. And that really is the whole build. The only thing left to do is to create a harness with the hooks on it. There are no hook eyes anywhere, and really it's unlikely I'll need to put any body weight in it. But I will put a nice eye on it. Now these lures are designed to troll, and really mostly used up north and out west for lake trout and salmon when they're running, and even stripers. And there are several ways to rig it for trolling. The simplest way is to use the flatline method. This is what I usually do, which is essentially just tying the lure on to a long line and letting it out behind your boat. In deeper water you're going to want to use a keel weight tied at the head of your leader. And even deeper water you're going to want one of these diving weights, or you can use downriggers. Now the harness consists of a ball chain with an eye on the front and an eye on the bottom and a large split ring on it. And from there you can rig either a single hook setup or a double single hook setup, or you can put treble hooks, either a single or double treble hooks. Typically what you'll see is a single treble hook right on the chain, a braided line bridle, and the second hook connected to the other end of that bridle. It really is an ideal setup for trolling. And truth be told, I've made 2 or 3 of these things in the past for trolling out in the Gulf of Mexico, and it's worked pretty well. I've caught mackerel with it, I've caught bluefish with it, but what I was after was mahi, and I've yet to catch one. So we're going to do something a little different from the ball chain, but the result is going to be the same. Now the key to the shape is as simple as the shape, right? Really all you need to know is the ratio between the height and the length. And that typically runs right at about 4.5 to 1. So that means that if we want to make a 4.5 inch long lure, the width here where we cut the lure has to be 1 inch. You don't have to be super exact with that ratio, but somewhere close to the 4.5 to 1 will get you a lure that will work. The other key part of the design is making sure that your material is really buoyant. So you don't want to use a dense wood. You want to use a very light wood. And you can actually even go with balsa on this. Now I'm not going to go with balsa. Typically you want to use something as light as cedar. I'm going to use cypress. It has very similar characteristics to cedar. And I might add a touch of weight just behind this port just to be sure that the lure is nice and head heavy. But I want to be sure that it's going to be nice and buoyant, because that's kind of key to the action of this lure. Alright, so this is my piece of cypress. You can see it's really just a cut off piece of branch. And I'm just peeling off the bark because it makes less of a mess to peel it off than it does to get it off on the lathe. Alright, that should do it. You'll find the relative center. And you do that by drawing a ton of lines, because this thing isn't a perfect circle. Then you place the center point right where you hit most of the pencil lead. And of course you do the same for both ends. And the rounder the stock, the fewer lines you have to make. And I'm going to go ahead and get this thing trued out nice and round. And then we'll talk a little bit more about how I get the shape and how I mark my fat point and where I'm going to cut. So there's a real rudimentary way to check if you're really nice and true. You can see this thing floats on top of the surface. And if I move it over to the part that isn't true, it bounces like crazy. All right, it's looking pretty good. I've got some pretty clean wood right here. Got one little wormhole right there, but I'm not gonna worry about that. Seems to be solid, no cracks. Let's go ahead and lay out how we're gonna do it. So if you look at my drawing and you look at the lure itself, you'll notice that really the widest point is somewhere just this side of that cut. It isn't at the point where you cut the angle for the face. It's approximately 2/3 the way from the tail. And that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna make our widest point be 2/3 of the length of the lure from the tail. And since we want this terminal height to be 1 inch, we'll have the highest point, capital H, be about 1 1/8 inches. That should give us that little bit of a taper down, and that's really mostly for aesthetics. It doesn't do a whole lot to the action. And when you talk about action with this lure, you gotta kind of be a little careful because it doesn't have a big movement. It sort of has a very slow and controlled little wobble in it as it dives. And you can get it to dive probably 5 feet, maybe a little more if you put out a lot of line as you're trolling. But as a casting lure, you're not gonna get a whole lot of depth out of it. You might get 2 feet, maybe 3 if you get a real good long cast. So I like to transfer all that information onto a piece of tape on my tool guide. This way I have it right in front of me. I mark the 2 ends for the length of the lure and then the point where it's going to be the thickest. As I get down closer and closer, I'll be able to measure out with some calipers how big it is, and I just need to make sure that I keep my end marks transferred into the wood. It's a little rough still, but I want to be able to have some room to do some sanding, get this thing cleaned up a little bit. We got our 1 inch up front where we're going to cut our angle, and we got our 1 1/8 right here at the wide point. Now I do have a little bit of a problem. I've got a big old wormhole there. That's okay. I'll fill that with some casting resin and it'll be fine. And it's starting to kick off right now. It'll be done setting in about 10 minutes and it actually will expand. So it'll like fill in all the little crevices inside that little wormhole and it'll sand down just as easy as the wood. And while it sets up, we'll clean up a little bit. All right, I've got it smooth enough, I think, and I'm gonna go ahead and chamfer this block off just back a little bit so I can get a saw in here to get that front dive surface. All right, I'm setting up a little bit of a jig by putting a magnet right here and a plate, a metal plate, and then using my little magnetic angle finder, I can see where I'm at, and it's right at 50 degrees right there. I'll hold the metal plate with my hand, make sure it doesn't move, and we'll get this thing started. All right, that's got us pretty far along. I'll go ahead and take this off, finish cutting this off with the bandsaw, and I'll clean up this cut, and we'll go to the next step. All right, that looks pretty good. I cleaned it up a little bit with the disc, and I just need to clean up some of these other saw marks. The rest of it looks really good. Even the wormhole looks nice. All right, the next step is to hollow this out, and I'll use this 3/4 inch sanding drum. So I finished it off with that die grinder because I wanted to be sure I had more of a concave than just sort of a grooved out cylinder. All right, so I'm pretty happy with the concave. There are some areas where the grain was a little soft and the sandpaper kind of went through it faster than the grain adjacent to it. So I've got some little bit of divots and stuff. I'm hoping to fill that with some UV clear coat. What I'll do is I'll just give it 2 or 3 coats and sand it back, and that should fill it in pretty well. When you cut through a cylinder, what you end up with is the shape of an ellipse. And that's actually the definition of an ellipse. It's basically a cut through a cylinder on a specific angle. And this is an ellipse guide. If you've ever done any hand drafting, you know what this is. You've used it. Each one of these rows of ellipses was created with the specific angle that's marked above these little columns. So if we line ours up, it should line up somewhere between the 55 degrees and the 45 degrees. And if you look at the 55 degree one, it's a little bit fat and not quite as long. And so if we go to the 45 degree one, you can see it's a little bit longer and not quite fat enough. Is kind of what I was hoping for. So I'm gonna mark the halfway point along that center line on that concave face. And I'll put a little divot in it, and I'm not gonna drill the hole through yet, but I am gonna put a temporary wire eye in there so I can hold it while I clear coat it. And this little twist eye should do the job. And now it's time to drill out the eye sockets. And I'm using the size for the biggest size eyes that I have. Now let's go ahead and put a coat of that UV resin on. And I'm going to put it on pretty heavy. Hopefully I'll be able to get away with just 1 coat and then a light sanding afterwards. And we'll get all those imperfections covered up. And I'll leave it in the turner for like 45 minutes. Alright, I left this thing going for about 2 hours last night, and I think we got pretty good initial coat on this thing. Still got a few rough spots. I'm going to sand it down. I'm not going to worry too much about the surface condition anymore. Now the key to drilling this hole is to understand that you're really not pulling the lure from here. You're pulling it from the belly. So it's kind of a weird arrangement, but it's really important that the hole fall right on the center line and right on the center line in the belly too. And what I like to do is I'll drill from both locations. I'll drill from the belly, starting right in that middle, and from the face, starting right in the middle. And hopefully those 2 holes align evenly, but if they're a little off, it's no big deal. What's important is that the ends be right where they need to be. Now that ball chain was a really clever solution to 2 issues. One, if this were a wire leader, 2 things could happen. It could kink coming through that face, and second, it can dig into the wood or the plastic. But what we're going to do is use a little rivet body and stick it in there. That'll protect the face and the belly. And I'm going to use a heavy monofilament leader to take the place of this ball chain. Now, if you want to use the original kind of ball chain and harness on these things, they still sell these harness sets. You can just buy them and put them in yours, or you can just buy the ball chain. And actually, that's a lot cheaper. They sell them for about 50 to 60 cents. And if you're interested, I'll go ahead and put a link down in the description. I don't get anything out of it. I'm not sponsored by anybody, but I thought it would be nice if you really wanted to do a lure that matched the original, you could still get the parts. All right, that's got it. Now I need to bore it out just a little bigger so that the rivet body will fit in it. But before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and drill a hole for a weight. I feel I need to add a weight to make up for the loss in that ball chain. What I did was I had a little piece of ball chain about a 1/2 inch long, and I weighed it and just extrapolated out to about 2.5 inches, and it weighed about 2 grams. So I'm going to add just a little more than 2 grams because the ball chain I have is a little smaller gauge than the stuff they actually used on this lure. So this little split shot weighs right about 2.6 grams. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to set that right behind where that wire comes out. All right, that should do it. I just need to put a little filler in there and sand it back. And I'll use a little bit of sawdust and UV resin. And it's just a matter of hardening this under the lights and sanding it back. All right, let's drill this hole bigger so we can get the rivet in. Before I can use this thing, I gotta knock the rivet pin out. And to do that, you just grab it with a pair of pliers. So the flange is outside, put it on something hard and tap the pliers. There you go, the pin comes right out. Let me do a little bit of sanding before I install the rivet. I've got the plug sanded down smooth, but now I want to take the luster off this clear coat. Alright, because this little edge on the inside of this tube is going to come in contact with my leader, I want to be sure that it's smooth. So I'm taking a little Dremel tool and I'm just going to hone it out and smooth it. And I hope you can see that's a nice smooth curve on the inside of that edge. And I do like to put my own spin on lures that I'm essentially making a copy of. So I try to do something just a little different from the original. So I'm using this rivet body and I'm going to leave that little tail sticking out exposed. I think it'll direct the harness back and down, and there'll be a nice hard spot for the harness to hit when you're pulling up on the line. And because this thing really doesn't see any real forces, I'm going to glue it in with some crazy glue, and that should be fine. Let's go ahead and take this thing to the paint booth. Alright, I had to create a way to hold on to this thing, so I stuck a little screw-in eye in the back, and I'll fill that hole later after we're done. And I put this little loop through the rivet. That'll give me something to hold on to so I can paint it and clear coat it. So I'll go ahead and wipe it down with some alcohol, and then I'm going to paint it with just an opaque white base, and we'll go from there. I ran out of the big eyes for this thing, and this is the closest size I have. Way too small. So we're gonna have to make our own. I've already leveled this off with some UV resin, and I'm just gonna cut some circles out of the foil tape, or actually just punch them out. I'm gonna use this aluminum tube that I've sharpened the edge on, and hopefully this will look halfway decent, because honestly, I did not plan for this. Should I paint the pupils on now or after it's on the body? Let's paint it now. So I'm going to place the pupil right on the edge of the eye and make it look like it's looking back. That looks kind of cool. Looks a little goofy, but that's not bad for not having eyes, having to make them yourself. I'm going to try stacking a little bit of UV on top and see if I can make it a little more 3D. There you go, that looks pretty good. We'll let that level for a little bit, and then we'll hit it with the UV light. Alright, so this definitely was not what I had planned, but I don't expect it to look perfect. Halfway decent, I hope. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and give it a couple of coats of the polyacrylic, get it ready for clear coating. Alright, I've got it on the hanger. Let's go ahead and put a clear coat on it. I'm running pretty low on the UV resin, so I got the bottle laying over. I'm putting a really thick coat on. I want it to have that sort of glassed over look. On lures that are big like this, that I know I'm going to take a little time to put this stuff on, I always try to make sure that it's late in the day, so any light coming through the window is minimal. I don't want this heavy coat of UV resin to start to tack up on me because a little bit of UV light is coming through the window. And we'll let that rotate for about 5 or 10 minutes to make sure it gets evenly distributed and nicely leveled and all the bubbles come out. And then we'll turn the lights on. Alright, so while that thing sets, I'm going to go ahead and make the harness. I've got some 60-pound mono leader wire, and I've got 125-pound Dyneema braid. I'm going to need a good split ring and a couple of #2 saltwater hooks. So the first thing I need is to cut about a foot of the Dyneema braided line. And I want a loop that's about 4 inches long. So that's the size of my loop right there. So I can tie these tag ends over a couple of times, like 2 overhand knots. And that should give me pretty close to 4 inches. And I'll snug that down really good. That will not come out. Trim off the tag ends and then burn it down. And that'll keep them from ever coming apart. Now I've got a short shank and a long shank hook here. I'm going to use the short shank hook closest to the head, and I'll mount that on the split ring. Okay. Now I'll take the Dyneema line, put it through the split ring, and then put it back through itself so the knot isn't in direct tension. And then to mount that second hook, I'll just push this loop through and run the hook through the loop again. And all we need now is to have the leader wire attached to the split ring. And I like to use about 48 inches, about 4 feet of leader wire. And I'll tie one end to this split ring, and the other end will have a barrel swivel on it. And the barrel swivel really is more to make it easy to tie on your main line than it is to actually get a swivel going. And cinch it down real good. I'll cut the tag so there's about 1/4 inch left, and then I'll burn it back just to form a little ball, and that basically won't allow that line to ever slip. So if it ever fails, it'll fail because it breaks, not because the knots go out. So I'll have to pass this end through the lure before I put the barrel swivel on it. Alright, this thing's looking pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and turn the lights on, and we'll let this thing go for a couple hours. So while the clear coat is curing, it's a perfect time to answer the question of the week. The question of the week had to do with the last lure I made. And before I get to the question, let me just say thank you to everybody who went out of their way to try to figure out what this lure is. I know you guys reached out to people, and folks contacted me, sent me photographs, and I really appreciate it, although we really haven't figured out what it was. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about, this lure is a replica, or an attempt at a replica from memory, of a lure I had probably 30 years ago. I lost it somehow, but it was a really productive lure, and I never ever been able to find it in any store ever. And I've looked everywhere. So I figured I'd make it and see if someone out there recognized it. Unfortunately, we haven't figured out what it is. It's a topwater design with these little gill slots in it that are cut in like sort of serrations. And the idea is as you pull the lure across the top of the water, those gills create a bubble trail. And that's the question. I had quite a few people ask me, what was the result? Did I actually get the gill plate to actually cause bubbles? And the answer is yes, and I don't know. Because the lure actually leaves a nice bubble trail behind it as you pull it along, but I can't tell whether it's the shape of the lure, the hooks, the blunt nose on the front, or if it's the gill slots themselves. But if the mission is to get a bubble trail, we're getting it. So sorry, I know there's not a whole lot of satisfaction in that answer. All right, thanks again to everybody for all your efforts, and if you want to have your question answered on a video, just leave me the question in the comments. You can send it to me via email at engineeredangler@gmail.com, or you can message me on Instagram. I pretty much check all those things daily. Thanks again, and keep the questions coming. All right, it's been in there for a while now. Oh yeah, that looks really nice. Finish came out perfect. And you know what? The eyes aren't as ugly as I thought they would be. They actually look kind of classic in a kind of traditional lure making kind of way. All right, nothing left to do but put my harness in there, get in the boat, and take this thing over to Lake Santa Fe and get some underwater shots. Because you can only really see what this thing does by trolling it and videoing it underwater. So let's do that. All right, a bit of a disaster. I was getting the boat ready to go out to the lake to do this stuff, and for some reason I just pulled the plug on the transom, the drain plug, and out came about a half a gallon of gasoline out of the inside of the hull. So that's really spooky. This whole place reeks of gasoline. I was looking at the hoses, and the only one it could be is the hose that runs forward underneath the decks and everything to the gas tank, and I can't get to it unless I pull the center console off the deck. This has been a pain. I had to rig it to one of the trusses on this thing. And now after doing all this inspection, I don't see anything else that could be leaking. So I'm gonna go ahead and replace this thing. Hopefully that's it. Otherwise, geez, I'd hate to think the gas tank is cracked, because that would just be it for this boat. So that's it for this video, and I'll have to post some underwater footage of that lure. Maybe I'll just make a short and post that on the channel. Anyway, thanks for watching. Wish me luck, subscribe, like, and I'll see you next Friday, I hope.